Hey, I just wanted to make a video about rock and roll because recently I've been doing some thinking again about rock and roll and its meaning in my life. I was kind of off on another class for a while. I was researching some historical things that I needed to look into. I traveled a little bit, spending some time with friends and family, what have you. So I haven't been playing as often as I usually play. Years ago, and so recently as I started again, I started to get to thinking about the substance really of rock and roll and what has drawn me back to rock and roll time and time again in my life. Time and time again, I have found various interests where I jump off on a tangent, and then always though I somehow manage to tie it back into rock and roll. It's kind of like rock and roll is that circle there, and everything else is just kind of shooting off of it. But rock and roll is the core, is the main center, the nerve center of my existence. I feel everything that I do is in some way tied ultimately to the music, to rock and roll, and to not only music in particular, but rock and roll in particular. Because for a long time, I fought, even if only in my mind, against the existence of genre. But now I've come to believe that rock and roll, to me, is in fact the superior music genre for a number of reasons. When you look at history and you study someone a great artist, typically the great artists seem to have two things in common. They not only were they prolific and able to relate with people, but they were able to relate with all people. So not just poor people, but and not just rich people, but all people: poor, rich, middle class, slaves, workers, whoever. They were able to relate with everybody, and I feel that this is why rock and roll really is the ultimate art form. In terms of music, film is up there, but even film, you kind of have to be particular with films. Not everybody likes the same films at all, but rock and roll can kind of typically, and for many years, only until very, very recently, was basically able to capture everybody. And when you think of rock and roll, you have to think of just how many sorts of music can really be blended in with it. I mean, along the history of rock and roll, so many various influences were taken and thrown right into it. I mean, initially you had the blues absorbed. The blues, some are going to even say that the blues is the entire foundation. The blues is the foundation, and has also just been absorbed into rock and roll. Reggae comes along in the 70s from Jamaica. It's immediately absorbed right into rock and roll. Opera, you look at that song by Queen. I always hear that song. I'll be driving around, I'll hear that song on the radio, Bohemian Rhapsody, and every time I'm just floored. I mean, we've never seen that again. This song was just completely, it was an opera in many ways. It was an opera. And again, so even opera, this classical, really, important, high class, high art form, absorbed into rock and roll. You look at the recordings of Led Zeppelin, you see many, many, signs that point towards a classical sort of culture. Jimmy Page is working with all sorts of very, ancient sort of instruments. I mean, many rock groups work with an organ. Many rock groups work with, these beautiful violinists, cello players, etc., etc. And also, another thing about rock and roll that I've always been very attracted to is how easily adaptable it is. If you want to make it a classical arrangement of a rock song, it 9 times out of 10 it generally works. An orchestra can play through the rock and roll songs. Granted, I'm sure in comparison to the normal repertoire that an orchestra would have, many of the rock songs are quite simple. But you look at something like Bohemian Rhapsody, or perhaps something like the Rain Song by Zeppelin, and it's not so easy for even an orchestra, or Stairway to Heaven. These are what I would consider really beyond rock and roll. I would consider these songs to be orchestral pieces. So in this manner, rock and roll really introduced me, someone who I really feel never should have been, coming from the position I came from in life, never should have been introduced to this kind of culture, but somehow indirectly wound up being thrown right into it, because rock and roll is a music of the streets. Many times, people from the streets are, at least slightly familiar with many rock and roll bands, and the working class culture, what have you. So, but the working class culture isn't really interested in classical music or high literature or these things. And yet, through rock and roll, via rock and roll, I was thrown right into these other things, became interested in these other things, and I'm so positive I never would have been introduced with. And you see this time and time again with rock and roll. And this is what people don't understand. People say often now, rock and roll, the new music, this hip hop, as good as some hip hop might be, this dance music, this dubstep, it's all just like rock and roll. It's just the new rock and roll. But I would argue, no, it's not. I would argue, no, it's not at all. I'm going to stand by my conviction here. I'm going to argue it's not like that at all, because rock and roll was drawing on the music of the past, whereas I feel that these new art forms aren't really drawing nor remembering the artists of the past. For example, I always use the Jim Morrison of the Doors as an example, because he was an extraordinary example of how rock and roll tied in with the past. I mean, Morrison didn't do any work as he didn't work with instruments. The only instrument he worked with was his voice, but he still made a substantial. He still gave a substantial gift to the culture of rock, because when Morrison was looking for inspiration to write his lyrics, he went back to some, what would be dubbed high-ended literature. Really, he was working from the works of these great poets who had lived in France or England or anything. People like William Blake or Baudelaire, and then we get this sort of these lyrics that are just very. I would call. I mean, of course, this doesn't shine through completely in his songs, because his songs were applicable to the street life, to the working class Joe listening in his car, in his truck or something. But Morrison was also drawing on a very high culture. So this is what I always found fascinating about rock and roll. This is the way these things blend right into it, and you're able to use these things. And I feel that in the modern culture, these things are just not happening. I don't know how to describe it really, but these things just aren't happening. This is what has fallen off. This is what I was always interested in, with Zeppelin and the Doors, the Stones, even, the history of rock and roll is just so vivid, so alive. There's so far to go with it. Most of the time, I'm not even playing. I'm actually reading about the history of these bands. I'm very interested in the creative process. How'd they get inspired? Who inspired them? I find out that, I remember when I found out about the Stones. I'm into the Stones. Who do the Stones like? Then go and go back to next thing I'm on this journey with the blues. Who did Jimmy Page like? Okay, now I'm listening to surf rock from California. I'm always jumping around, Sublime, oh my God, he liked reggae, so now I'm going to reggae. All these influences coming together. This is what I love most about rock and roll, and I always felt even more influences are going to come. I can see now in the future what I want to see, really. I do believe that hip-hop needs to be brought in more, because it's captured the minds of the people, and even this dance music. Rock and roll always did work largely off of, people want to dance to their music. Very important. If you want to make a hit record, I feel it needs to be something people could dance to. And a lot of the times these days, I almost feel that young people feel they can't really dance to a rock and roll record. And many of us, admittedly, as modern rock and roll fanatics, we just listen. I just listen to it again like it's an opera piece or something. I sit back like this and pensively listen. This isn't what the average guy they'll watch from his music, the average girl. They want to dance. So it does need that element if it wants to remain popular. I was thinking of that too, because Gene Simmons recently made some comments saying, rock is dead, etc. So, I was just thinking about it, pondering it, and sometimes I like to have an old soapbox here at my microphone and just, give my thoughts on it all. But, I think rock and roll is the greatest thing. It changed my life, man, and I'll always love it.